U.S.-Canada trade tensions erupted into a full-scale crisis when the Trump administration delivered what it described as a final trade directive to Ottawa, an ultimatum framed in stark, non-negotiable terms. Canada was instructed to comply immediately with sweeping U.S. demands or face a 100% tariff on all exports entering the American market. Such a measure would effectively double the price of Canadian goods for American consumers overnight and threaten deeply integrated industries on both sides of the border. Given that roughly 70% of Canadian exports are traditionally destined for the United States, the threat carried the weight of an economic shock capable of destabilizing not only Canada's economy, but also supply chains across North America. What had begun as escalating disputes over tariffs and trade alignment was suddenly transformed into a confrontation with systemic implications for global markets, energy security, and geopolitical alliances. The ultimatum followed weeks of mounting friction. Washington had pressed Ottawa for financial concessions, regulatory alignment, and even partial claims tied to strategic infrastructure, including the newly completed Gordie Howe International Bridge, an emblem of cross-border integration funded primarily by Canada. The message from Washington was rooted in a long-standing assumption. Canada's structural dependence on U.S. market access left it with limited room to maneuver. The American calculation appeared straightforward. Faced with the threat of a blanket tariff, Canada would ultimately prioritize short-term economic stability over political sovereignty. Yet this assumption underestimated both the complexity of modern supply chains and the evolving strategic posture of Ottawa under Prime Minister Mark Carney. The directive itself contained three central demands that went beyond conventional trade disputes. First, Canada was instructed to eliminate all retaliatory tariffs within 2 weeks, while the United States retained its own, creating a clear asymmetry designed to favor American producers. Second, Ottawa was asked to abandon its broader economic engagement roadmap with China and grant Washington effective veto authority over future Indo-Pacific trade agreements. This demand extended the dispute beyond economics into strategic autonomy, challenging Canada's ability to diversify its partnerships. Third, the United States sought guaranteed discounted energy exports, effectively locking in below-market pricing for Canadian crude flowing to U.S. refineries. Collectively, these conditions signaled an effort not merely to rebalance trade flows, but to reshape Canada's economic sovereignty. Prime Minister Mark Carney's response reframed the confrontation. In a nationally televised address, he rejected the ultimatum while emphasizing structural interdependence rather than vulnerability. Canada, he argued, was not a peripheral supplier, but a foundational component of American energy and industrial capacity. Approximately 3.8 million barrels of Canadian crude oil flow daily into U.S. refineries, many of which are technically configured to process heavy Canadian blends. Substituting these supplies in the short term would require costly logistical adjustments and could drive significant fuel price increases. Carney further highlighted Canada's dominant role in supplying uranium to American nuclear facilities, which generate roughly 1/5 of U.S. electricity. By underscoring these realities, Carney shifted the narrative from Canadian dependence to mutual exposure. This strategic pivot, informally described by observers as a new doctrine of economic resilience, challenged Washington's leverage. Rather than appealing for compromise, Ottawa outlined a counter-strategy aimed at reducing reliance on a single export destination. Central to this response was a proposed acceleration of westward energy infrastructure designed to expand pipeline and liquefied natural gas capacity toward Pacific markets. By increasing access to Asian buyers, Canada signaled its intention to transform geographic constraints into strategic flexibility. While such infrastructure projects require years to reach full operational capacity, their announcement alone altered market expectations by introducing credible alternatives to U.S.-centric trade patterns. Simultaneously, Ottawa unveiled domestic procurement reforms intended to prioritize Canadian suppliers in federal contracts. Although framed as a defensive economic measure, the move had symbolic weight. It suggested that Canada was prepared to absorb short-term adjustment costs in exchange for greater long-term autonomy. In parallel, the government initiated exploratory discussions with European partners and the United Kingdom to strengthen supply chain cooperation, independent of both Washington and Beijing. These discussions reflected a broader recalibration in global trade, as middle powers increasingly seek to hedge against great power volatility. Financial markets responded immediately to the escalating rhetoric. Uranium prices surged amid concerns about supply disruptions and regulatory uncertainty. Oil futures experienced heightened volatility as traders priced in potential disruptions to cross-border flows. Investors sought refuge in precious metals, reflecting broader anxieties about inflation and recession risks tied to tariff escalation. Analysts warned that a 100% tariff could feed directly into consumer price indices, compounding inflationary pressures at a politically sensitive moment for the United States. The interconnected nature of North American manufacturing, particularly in automotive production, where components cross borders multiple times during assembly, raised the prospect of cascading shutdowns if trade channels were abruptly constricted. The reaction within the United States revealed the constraints of unilateral trade pressure in a deeply integrated economic ecosystem. Industry leaders, particularly in automotive manufacturing and petroleum refining, expressed concern that the proposed measures would inflict collateral damage on American firms. Refineries optimized for Canadian heavy crude could not easily pivot to alternative suppliers without substantial retrofitting. Automakers dependent on just-in-time logistics warned that disruptions at the border could halt production within days. These domestic pressures complicated the administration's calculus, highlighting the tension between political signaling and industrial practicality. Beyond the immediate economic stakes, the crisis illuminated structural shifts in global trade governance. For decades, North American integration operated on the assumption of relative political stability and mutual economic gain. The ultimatum challenged that foundation, raising questions about the durability of long-standing agreements and the credibility of cross-border commitments. Canada's response, meanwhile, reflected a broader trend among mid-sized economies seeking diversification amid great power rivalry. The episode underscored how economic tools, tariffs, export controls, infrastructure policy have become instruments of strategic competition rather than merely commercial negotiation. Whether the confrontation ultimately results in escalation or negotiated de-escalation, its long-term implications are already visible. Canada has accelerated conversations about energy corridors to Asia and reinforced trade ties with Europe. The United States faces renewed scrutiny over its dependence on external inputs, critical to domestic energy generation and industrial production. Both nations have been reminded that economic power in an interconnected era is reciprocal rather than absolute. Attempts to weaponize interdependence can generate unintended feedback loops, amplifying volatility rather than securing advantage. At its core, the crisis represents a test of how advanced economies manage asymmetry without undermining mutual prosperity. Canada's economy remains closely linked to the United States, and diversification will require sustained investment and political consensus. The United States, for its part, must weigh the short-term leverage of tariff threats against the systemic costs of destabilizing integrated supply chains. The episode illustrates that economic statecraft, once deployed, can reshape expectations and alliances in ways that outlast the immediate dispute. As global markets absorb the shock, policymakers on both sides confront a new reality. The era in which cross-border trade operated largely outside the realm of overt geopolitical confrontation has ended. Economic relationships are now inseparable from questions of sovereignty, security, and strategic alignment. For Canada, the crisis has catalyzed a re-examination of dependency and diversification. For the United States, it has revealed the limits of coercive leverage in a world defined by mutual vulnerability. Whatever the final settlement, the confrontation has altered the trajectory of North American economic relations, embedding caution, diversification, and strategic calculation into what was once assumed to be an unshakable partnership.